Belyaev was a brave man to even consider such an audacious type of a project in the Soviet Union at that particular time. Some of the questions he had in his mind is he wondered how it was, at that point they kind of knew a bit about genetics. This was just about the time Watson and Crick were understanding the structure of DNA. It was well after Mendel had figured out the concept of heritability. And so they understood it. They understood that the dog was probably an ancestor of the wolf. But he thought, well, why was it that man, thousands of years ago, would have tolerated wolves hanging out around them? I mean, at this point, people would have been on the dinner list for wolves. So why would man not have gotten rid of them at that point? So he wondered about how it was that we would have actually let them into the community at that point and domesticated them. It didn't make sense to him. So he didn't understand it. He also didn't understand something that was pretty well known at that time, was that when you domesticate an animal, there's certain traits that always seem to show up. Certain morphological changes to an animal that seem to happen and come in conjunction with domestication. And it just didn't make sense that people would be breeding for these particular traits while they were domesticating animals. They figured, well, he thought, yeah, well, they would certainly be domesticating them to be tame. You didn't want your animal, your domesticated animal, to eat you, but why would you have chose an animal that had floppy ears or any of these other traits that domesticated animals tend to have? It just didn't make sense to him. So he envisioned this experiment to try to explain some of these things. So this wasn't a new concept at all, these changes that occurred due to domestication. This guy you may have heard of named Darwin actually was the first one to think about the fact that, or actually write down the fact that all these domesticated animals that he's seen around the world have these certain traits, whether they're dogs or goats or sheep or any of the other things. They find when he compared them to their wild counterparts, there were certain things that he saw in common. Other than the fact that they were tamer than their wild counterparts, there were these certain features that always seemed to kind of go together. And at that point, he had no idea why that would be, but he just noted that that's the way it is. And Belyaev was saying, well, why is it that these traits are actually associated with domestication? And so he set out to figure that out. And these are some of the different things that you kind of always see in many domesticated animals. For instance, you see varying sizes. If you look at dogs, for instance, from the smallest Pekingese to the largest Great Dane, you see these huge discrepancy in the size of the animal. You also see something called piebald coloration. You'll see spots, white spots are showing up on the animal when you domesticate them, which you do not see in their wild counterparts. He wondered why that was. You see wavy and curly hair showing up that's not in their domestic counterparts. You'll see a rolled tail. Very common in domestic animals. Dogs will have a curled tail, where wolves will never have a curled tail. Why is that? He also shows shorter tails in dogs, as well as floppy ears. A lot of dogs will have floppy ears. They're the only wild animal that has floppy ears are elephants. Animals generally do not have floppy ears because it doesn't make sense for them to have floppy ears from an evolutionary standpoint. But somehow when we domesticate animals, many dogs, many goats, many sheep, all of a sudden they get these floppy ears. Well, why is that?
Oh, the reproduction.
Oh, last one, importantly one,
see, look.
is the fact that when you domesticate animals, oftentimes they find that their number of reproductive cycles per year actually increase. So generally a dog or a wolf will have one estrus per year, where most domesticated breeds of dogs have 2 estrus cycles per year. Why would selecting for tameness be related to how the reproductive frequency of an animal? It didn't make sense to him. What's the causal factor behind that? And so Belyaev actually used that in order to convince the Russian government at the time, which once again was against this concept of genetics. They viewed this was shortly after World War II, And the Nazis did a lot with genetics, and so the Russians kind of considered it kind of fascist science, this concept of genetics. And but he convinced them, he said, well, if you allow me to do these experiments, I can figure out a way to make these foxes actually reproduce more often. So because they can reproduce more often, they could have more kids. Because they can have more kids, we can get more revenue from these animals. So that was what he convinced the government he was doing, but that's really not what he was doing. He was making this experiment, designing this experiment, so he could understand what domestication was all about. How did dogs come from wolves? What was that process? Why do these animals have all these different traits that you see when you just select for tameness? What's the connection there? And he was very interested in that. So the design of their experiment was a very simple experiment he did, but it just went on for a very long time. You know, evolution is a very long process. And so what he was trying to do is he was trying to condense that process into a very short time scale. And, you know, one of the things he wondered was, like, so why is it, so potentially if you breed for tameness, I can make an animal tamer. So why would Paleolithic man, why would he have put the resources forward to breed a wolf if it was going to take 1,000 years for it to be any tamer? It would make no sense. His theory was it would have to be a very quick change. These people would have to have seen that this animal was getting tamer, you know, in a matter of years as opposed to decades or centuries for it to make sense for them to do that. And that's one of the things he was very interested about. So what they did for this experiment is he went around all of Estonia at the time, and he went to these fur farms, and he asked the purveyors of the fur farms to show him his tamest foxes. Most of the foxes would, if you stuck your hand in their cage, would take your fingers off. That's what a wild animal will do when a human does that. But every now and again, these fur farms would have animals that, well, they wouldn't be friendly when they stuck their fingers in there. They wouldn't bite them either. They may go to the back of the cage, they may not advance, but they would show a little bit less aggression than the rest of the animals. And so he asked if he could have those, if he could have those particular animals. And so what he did is he started an experiment where every year he would breed some animals together, and he would only pick a very small number that he would actually allow to reproduce. So it turned out to be like 4 to 5% of the males, and about 20% of the females were actually allowed to reproduce. And they would do very stringent behavioral testing on them each year to determine which of the new crop they were going to actually allow to reproduce. Very simple design. And what he noticed is relatively quickly, he started to see some changes occurring in the behavior of these animals. So one of the things at that point he had to do was to control for a certain factor. People have heard about nature versus nurture. So the nature is the genetics of something. How is behavior inherited from your parents? The nurture is how was a particular animal raised? How is it socialized, as it were with dogs? And so both of these factors can actually affect behavior. And what Bassett was interested in was actually just the genetic component. He wasn't concerned about the socialization or the nurture component. So what they did is they tried to control that by having just time-dosed exposure to people. Each of these foxes were just tested, behaviorally tested, and they actually measured how much time a human being was actually interacting with that fox, so that they could say that all of their foxes had the same amount of interactions with humans, and so any changes that they saw would be due just to the genetics. It wouldn't be due to the fact that these foxes were potentially socialized better. And that was a very important part of what he was looking at, because it wouldn't do any good. It goes to the difference between domesticating an animal and taming an animal. Many different animals can be tamed. You can take a hyena, take it from its parents when it's 10 days old, bottle feed it, raise it, and actually that hyena probably isn't going to eat me if I did that. It would eat all of you, but not me. That's a tame animal. because it somehow forms a bond with an individual. There's a difference between domestication, where you make a heritable change. That particular hyena, its offspring is going to be no more friendly than a normal wild hyena. Where when you make a change that in domestication, the offspring are actually going to be tame as well. So it's a heritable change. So there's some genetic basis that's causing changes to something in that animal that is going to be inherited from generation to generation. And so that's what he wanted to be able to control for. So these are some pictures of some of the changes that they saw within 5, 6, 7 generations. So relatively quickly, they started seeing things occurring to these animals. For instance, you see up here an animal with floppy ears. And floppy ears is one of these hallmarks of domestication. And all of a sudden, he started seeing foxes born with floppy ears. And that's not to say that all of the foxes had floppy ears. I mean, these foxes are 60 years out plus from the beginning of the experiment, and none of them have floppy ears. But what I can tell you about these foxes is these foxes' ears probably came up a little bit later than a wild fox's ears would come up. And so you see these sort of changes occurring. You see the piebald patterning in that fox, the white patches around the fox. That's another thing that you see very commonly in domestication. So relatively quickly, and this was very exciting for him because one of the things he wanted to prove was these changes could actually occur very fast, and they were actually occurring very quickly. So this chart just shows some of these different characteristics that they actually see and how prevalent it is in their populations. And so again, as I was saying, it's not like every animal that is tame has these different features, but they see it more often in the tame populations than they do in their control populations. So they'll see curly tails, they'll see floppy ears, they'll see these piebald patterns more often in the tame population than they see in their control population. So why is that? Why does there seem to be some link between just selecting for tameness? Because we have to remember, they're not selecting for any of these traits. It's not like they see an animal that's piebald and then they try to breed that one to another one that's piebald. They just breed for tameness. They just do a test to see how will that animal come towards people, and if it will, they allow it to reproduce. And then consequently, they're seeing all these changes starting to occur. So here's other things they find about them when they look, is they actually find when they look at their brain chemistry, and this goes back to my original premise, the hippie fox, is that they actually have more serotonin in their brain, and they have less cortisol in their body. So cortisol is the fight or flight hormone. It's the stress hormone. So when you get stressed out, your adrenal glands put out cortisol, and it's indicative that you've been stressed. Serotonin is kind of this feel-good, happy chemical. It's the neurotransmitter that you increase when you take Prozac. So it's kind of like, AXA, it's kind of like you're on Prozac all the time with these foxes. And so, again, why is it that just selecting for this one feature, you're seeing all these types of changes occurring to the physiology of these animals? So there's a theory as to why this all is the case, and it's called Domestication Syndrome. And this theory states that very early in embryonic development, when the cells of the embryo are just first beginning to differentiate, there's a particular class of stem cells that are called neural crest cells. So when the embryo is starting to form the neural tube, which is going to where the spinal cord and the brain is going to form out of, there's these few cells that are called neural crest cells. And the interesting thing about these neural crest cells is they differentiate into many different types of cells. They differentiate into pigment cells, piebald patterning. They differentiate into cartilage cells, floppy ears or not floppy ears. They differentiate into cells that actually form the adrenal glands, lower cortisol. So all these types of things that we're seeing in domestication can be explained to some degree, not completely, but by some degree, to a deficit in the amount of neural crest cells that are actually formed during embryonic development. So it excited scientists to actually find some causal relation between all these things they're seeing in domestication, these that seem completely unrelated to tameness, and yet somehow they actually are all related, because they're all related to these particular stem cells, these neural crest cells, very early on in embryonic development. So that's actually a relatively exciting finding that people have determined. So there's all kind of, one of the things that Lev wanted to understand was, how was the dog domesticated? That was one of his premises. So there's three basic theories as to how this occurred. The first theory is the dog as a natural species. And what that means is that people had absolutely nothing to do with the development of the dog. So that theory states that perhaps 10,000 years ago, or 100,000 years ago, at somewhat of the beginning of the Ice Age, so the last Ice Age lasted approximately from 100,000 years ago to say 10,000 years ago. So maybe at the beginning of that last Ice Age, there was a lot of changes going on. And we know this is the case because a lot of changes occurred in a lot of animals at that point. And perhaps a niche opened up for a particular animal that was smaller than a wolf, and yet bigger than a jackal. Something that could take prey, maybe its size, or maybe 1.5 times its size, smaller than the prey that wolves were taking at that point. And so people had absolutely nothing to do with it. It was just an animal that just developed naturally. Now the problem with this theory is if wolves, or if dogs developed 100,000 years ago, where are they? What happened to all those remains of these dogs? Because the archaeological evidence has never unearthed something that looked like a dog from 100,000 years ago. So if they were there 100,000 years ago, where are they? And while that's not a deal breaker necessarily, because there are examples of other animals that we don't know we don't find archaeological evidence of their distant ancestors, it seems a bit suspect that could be the case. So while that's a possibility, most researchers at this point think humans were in some way involved in the domestication of the dog. And you can take a soft approach to that or a hard approach to that. The soft approach to that is wolf self-domestication. So if you imagine life of people 25, 30,000 years ago, most scientists think at this point dogs developed maybe between 15 and 40,000 years ago. If you imagine what people were doing at that point, people were hunter-gatherers at that point. There were no brew pubs, there was none of this stuff going on at that point. So, people had a hard life at that point. But what they did have is they did have these groups of people that kind of stayed in one place for a while and moved around a bit, and so they had garbage. Everyone generates garbage. And so they must have had some place to put their garbage. And so the wolves at that point, being opportunists, might have said, I'm going to eat their garbage. And particularly the wolves, when the Paleolithic man, when the Paleolithic man would come with his garbage and go to drop it off, it was the wolves that didn't run away that would get the best garbage. And so the wolves that got the best garbage would have the most chance of reproducing to the next generation. So it was something called flight distance. The animals with the lowest flight distance, I could come 30 feet to them and they won't run away, where others will run away when I go 100 feet from them. So it's the ones that had that lowest flight distance were the ones that were likely to reproduce in the next generation, and consequently their genes would be propagated, and consequently those animals would become tamer and tamer and tamer as time went on. So that's kind of the wolf self-domestication hypothesis. And I think at this point, that's kind of what most people are leaning to. But one thing to remember is these are not all mutually exclusive. You can have a little bit of one and a little bit of another going on. Because the next one is the tame baby wolf hypothesis, meaning, so Paleolithic man was hanging out and they found a den of wolves where the mother might have been killed. And they said, oh my God, aren't these wolves cute? I'm going to bring one into my little group of people, and I'm going to raise it. And it's a possibility, but again, maybe this wolf would have grown up and eaten all of that. So they might have not wanted to do that at that particular time. So there are some people who don't think that's a good hypothesis to have, just because of the nature of man and wolves at that particular time. Now, luckily, there is some evidence out there that kind of guides us as to the right answers. Now, this first picture here is something called Goyet dog, although it's not a dog. They call it a dog, but it's not a dog. It's skeletal remains from over 30,000 years ago that were dug up. And at one point, people were all excited about it because they thought this was the first dog, and it really pushed back how far ago dogs were domesticated to over 30,000 years ago. But as they looked at it more and more and more, they actually discovered that it was indeed a wolf. So it really didn't help them out too much. What did help them is this next one was called Von Oberkassel dog, which is the first real remains of a dog that people have found. So it's about 14,000 years ago, this particular dog died. And one interesting thing about the way this dog died is they think this dog died of distemper. And what's interesting is that there's evidence that people took care of this dog. This dog lived a lot longer than a dog should have lived with distemper. So clearly people were taking care of it. There was some value that they had to this dog. So again, 14,000 years ago, people were basically worried about survival. They didn't have a lot of time to mess with their dog. So if this had to be of real value to them. Dogs had to be of value to people at this point because they put a lot of resources into trying to nurse this dog back to health. And so that's really the first evidence that we know that it certainly wasn't earlier than 14,000 years ago that people and dogs were living together. Dogs were domesticated at some level by then. And by domesticated, I don't mean it's like your Labrador. It's going to sit on your lap and roll around. It's a very different thing. But at least this dog wasn't going to eat them. So that was very important to these people. Another finding that was really exciting for people is a particular piece of a rib bone that was found in the Taimyr Peninsula in Siberia, which is in the northernmost part of Russia. Siberia. And the interesting thing about this, it was a wolf. They did DNA analysis on this particular rib bone, and it turned out to be a wolf. They called it the Taimyr wolf. But the interesting thing about it is genetically, it was halfway between a dog and present-day wolves. It was not like any present-day wolves, but they talked about it as a trifurcation of that particular line of animals. And this was about 37,000 years ago when they radiocarbonated this. So they know that about 37,000 years ago, there was an ancestor of the dog that was also the ancestor of our gray wolves, the wolves we see around today. And actually, that is an important point. Because when you talk to most people and they say, well, the dog evolved from the wolf, what they think about is that guy over there on my right. That's just the timber wolf of today. But that particular animal matures at, 90 to 110 pounds. It's an apex predator. It's going to eat people 30,000 years ago. So this is the animal that you probably didn't want hanging around where you were living. This animal over here, it's called the Indian wolf. Now the Indian wolf matures at maybe 50 to 60 pounds. It's actually much closer to what we consider as a dog today. So the thing to take away from that is that when people say the dog descended from the wolf, don't erase what you think about a wolf in your head, because that's not the wolf that the dog probably descended from. The dog descended from an ancestor, or the common ancestor between gray wolves of today and our domesticated dog was this animal, whatever it was. And it was probably a lot smaller than the timber wolves we see of today. And actually, a lot like these little singing fellows back here. That's kind of what we think of the animal, or at least Australian dingoes. That size is what we think the animal that dogs actually came from was probably kind of like. Here they are. So wouldn't it be nice if we had a living example today of what the first dogs were like? And it turns out we just may. We may have an example of what these dogs are like. The Australian dingoes and the New Guinea singing dogs were probably what we know canids evolved in North America. Somehow they ended up getting to Australia. So we know people must have brought them there. So at some point before the dingoes and the New Guinea singing dogs got there, they were domesticated. But exactly when that was, we don't exactly know. But a couple things we do know is we do know back in between 100,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, sea levels were much lower because a lot of ocean water was locked up in ice. And so Indonesia and Australia, well, Australia and New Guinea were one continent. They were connected. Indonesia and this continent had maybe 50 miles of water between them. So we know dogs probably can't swim 50 miles. Next up. Next, are you the comic relief, Maxa? Yeah, so these dogs tell us a lot about migration patterns of animals, of dogs in particular, and humans, because we know humans brought their dogs with them. So it tells us about how these dogs migrated around the globe. So this is an example of some different scientists, how they feel this particular migration patterns occurred. And one of the things scientists are trying to figure out now is exactly where the first domestication event occurred, where it was that dogs were first domesticated. And one group of scientists thinks it was in Southeast Asia. And so what they use as evidence for this is they did DNA sequencing on a whole bunch of dogs from that area. And they find the genetic diversity of those dogs in that area is much higher than the genetic diversity anywhere else. And it's actually much like when they do DNA testing on people, they find the greatest genetic diversity within people occurs in Africa. And it's pretty well believed now that humans evolved in Africa. And so the same holds true with dogs, they believe, is because they see the greatest genetic diversity in Southeast Asia, they feel that's where actually dogs were first domesticated. Another group of people came along and they actually dug up remains of dogs 5, 10,000 years old, and they managed to get DNA out, amplify it, and actually run sequencing on it. And they found that the dogs that were actually in Europe seemed to be more closely related to wolves than the dogs that were sequenced in Asia. So this group of people said, well, no, they didn't, the first domestication event didn't occur in Asia, it actually occurred in Europe. It couldn't be both necessarily. Well, then this other group of people in the United Kingdom, they unearthed some remains near Stonehenge, actually, and it's called Lagrange dog. And when they sequenced that dog, they came up with a new theory that you can kind of call the grand unification theory of dog domestication, because what they did is they said, well, no, there were multiple domestication events. Dogs were domesticated both in Europe and in Asia. And then what happened is the Asian dogs moved over to Europe and actually genetically diluted the dogs that were in Europe, which is why modern day dogs seem more like these Asian dogs. A lot of scientists don't believe them, just like the grand unification theory. A lot of scientists don't believe in that, but that's a whole different story. So back to our little friends, Maxa. So what now, these guys have been bred for 60 years in Russia. So scientists all of a sudden became aware of them. When the Soviet Union fell, basically funded, no one even knew about this program in the Western part of the world. This was pretty secret in Russia, or in the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union dissolved, basically funding for this program went with it. And so an individual named Melatrut, who was then Belev had passed away at that point, who was now in charge of the program, put a call out to the West and explained what they were doing at that point. And so researchers from the West were saying, wow, that's really incredible that you have an experiment going for 60 years. That's pretty cool. We want to find out what you actually did. So one of the first Western researchers to go over there was a guy named Brian Hare. And he is at Duke University. He runs the Animal Cognition Center there. And he's done a lot of experimentation trying to understand what makes dogs unique. And one of the experiments that he conducts is called a point gaze experiment. So what he does is he has a dog, and the dog sits there, and he takes 2 cups. And the owner will look and point at a cup. And then the dog goes. And the question is, does the dog go to the cup that the person is pointing at and looking at, or does it go to the other cup? Or is it, is it 50-50 between the two? Is it random which cup he's going to go to? And he finds that dogs will actually most of the time go to the cup that the owner is looking and pointing at. And for people who have dogs, they say, well, that's not that remarkable. But the interesting thing is when you do the same experiment on chimpanzees, which are the closest relatives of humans, chimps will be 50-50. They don't care that you're looking and pointing at a cup. And so what is it about dogs that makes them understand human gestures? Why is it? And my theory on that, and if anyone's listening to it, which you're probably not, but is that back when the person was going to the garbage dump with their garbage and the wolf was there, dogs had to, or these proto-dogs or wolves at that point, had to have a good ability to understand what was in that guy's head. Is this guy going to kill me, or is he going to give me the junk? And the dogs that were good at determining the difference were probably more likely to procreate and pass their genes forward than the ones that were not. And this experiment kind of shows that that is a possibility, because dogs seem to have this uncanny ability to understand what we're thinking, our human body language. And so one of the things Brian Hare was interested in is, well, these foxes that have now been bred for 60 years for tameness, did they somehow acquire some of this ability to understand human body language? And it turns out they did. Okay, so when he tested the foxes against dogs in this same experiment, he found no statistical difference between the two groups. So foxes did every bit as good as dogs, which we know do better than chimpanzees and a lot of other animals at understanding human body language. So what was it about just selecting for tameness that all of a sudden these animals, next up, all of a sudden they kind of get what we say? And I see it every day in dealing with these guys, that somehow they look at you. And I also deal with non-Russian foxes, and I can tell you with the Russian foxes, they get you more than other foxes do. So something about just breeding for tameness allows them to be more able to pick up human body cues, it seems to me. Brian Hare also did an experiment where he had a person touch an object, and then he had an inanimate object touching an object. And it turned out that the object that the person was touching, the fox would go to much more often than the inanimate object touching it. So it's like these foxes get humans, get what we are, what we're about, a lot more than non-domesticated, the ones that were not selected for tameness do. And again, I think this could have a large part to do with the fact that because these foxes have less cortisol or serotonin, they're less freaked out about the world when people are around, that they're more able to pick up on a lot of these cues that people are always emitting. And so they're able to learn them where a more wild animal is not. So another thing where people are really excited about now is really learning the genetics. Why are these animals? We know from the experiments like Brian Hare's that these animals are different. They behave differently than a wild fox do or the control animals do, but why is that? And so an individual out of the University of Illinois, Anna Kukokova, she is very into understanding these animals. And one of her first tasks was trying to map the fox genome to both the dog genome and the human genome. So foxes have about 34 chromosomes, and some really small ones too, but mostly they're about 34 chromosomes. Dogs have 78 chromosomes. Humans have 46 chromosomes, all different. And the way that happens in evolution is, for instance, going from a fox, which is about 1 million or 10 million years removed from a dog, is these chromosomes will change between fusion and fission events. So different chromosomes will come together and bond together, and then, you know, 1 million years apart will split again, and they all shuffle around. And so it's really a chore to try to figure out, to put it all back together and see any particular section in the dog chromosome, that analogous section in the fox chromosome. But that's what she's up to doing over there, and she's done a quite good job of it. And one of the things that she's found, before I go into that, I'm going to give, for people who aren't up to on genetics here, which might be one or two of you, a little refresher here, Genetics 101. So when you inherit genes, you inherit a chromosome from your father and a chromosome from your mother. And there's different versions of genes called alleles. So you will inherit one particular version and allele from your mother and one from your father. Now these two alleles can be the same or they can be different. And so this is actually a key point in trying to understand particular genes that have been selected for during domestication. So what Anna is looking at is, first what she did is she analyzed it to the point that she could actually differentiate between populations. So these foxes that have been bred for 60 years for tameness and foxes that were not, you can actually, genetically, you can determine that they're two separate populations. So that was the first thing. The second thing she did was trying to figure out particular genes or alleles that were selected for during this domestication process. And one of the genes that she found in this case, or one of the alleles of a gene that she found, was this particular gene called SORCS1. And the interesting thing about this particular gene is it's involved in your brain, and it codes for neuroplasticity. So the thought is that perhaps domestication has a lot to do with the brain's ability to rewire itself. We know brains can change, you can learn stuff and so on and so forth, but perhaps a domesticated animal is more able to change from its basal nature because you selected it for some particular trait. And that's one of the things Anna is looking at. She's also looking at this interesting gene that she's found has been selected for. They found about 130 different genes that had a signal as being selected for during this domestication process. Another one is this one called WBSCR17, which stands for Williams-Barré Syndrome Chromosome Region 17. And this is actually very interesting to people because there's a condition that people can have called Williams syndrome. And one of the things that this is characterized, there's a whole bunch of negative things about it that afflict people, but one of the real positive things about it, in a sense, is that these people are very, very friendly. People who have changes in this particular region of their genome are just super friendly. Caregivers and people working in research say if these people had tails, they'd be wagging them all the time. That's how they describe them. And what they're finding is this particular gene also seems to be altered in domestication. So is there somehow some correlation between that? Is this gene that we're selecting for somehow have to do with us being friendly? Another researcher that is doing similar work, and this time dogs. So Anna was doing it on foxes, and Bridget von Holt out of Princeton is doing it on dogs. And sure enough, she's finding those same types of genes. This Williams-Barré Syndrome chromosome region 17, in that particular region of the genome in dogs, we find that's been selected for in some way, shape, or form. So how does that correlate to this friendliness? The other interesting thing is she's found is that many of the genes that she's finding that have been selected for in domestication of dogs seem to be altered in some way in people with social bonding disorders, like autism. So is somehow autism and all the things associated with it somehow related to domestication? And that's a big question that people have right now is, and if it is, can these animals help us to find some different therapies for those sort of disorders, and potentially they can. And the interesting thing is with animals like these, particularly these foxes, because they were only selected for one thing, tameness, when geneticists look at their genomes, when they find something different, there's a pretty good chance the reason it's different is because of the selection for tameness. When you look at dogs, it's a little bit more difficult because dogs have been selected for a whole host of different things. So it's very difficult to say there's a causal relation between a particular gene or allele of a gene and a particular behavioral trait. But foxes, that is actually a lot easier. And so sure enough with Bridget, it's the same gene. And what this chart shows is, it shows the, in a nutshell, it shows basically how much homozygosity there is in the genome for a particular allele. So if you're selecting for a trait, as we are Genetics 101, we have two versions of one from our father, one from our mother. And if we find that we're selecting for one, we're going to get more and more and more of just one particular version of a gene. And so when we see that more than we expect within the genome, we can say, well, that gene was probably selected for. And that's what we find here. These are all genes that didn't reach a level of significance, but the Williams-Barré syndrome chromosome region 17 actually was, they found a level of significance that this particular gene was actually selected for, or this allele was selected for in domestication. Another, same thing. This particular, out of Sweden, these researchers found that when they were doing that same sort of work, they actually looked at beagles. And they tested a whole bunch of beagles, and then they rated which beagles were most friendly. And then they went and looked at their genomes. And sure enough, they found a correlation between certain genes or alleles in the beagles that were most friendly, as you can see here. And sure enough, a lot of these particular regions of the genome have to do with social bonding disorders in humans. And so it's a little bit interesting to me, and a lot of people, when I tell them this, they say, well, that doesn't make sense. Why are humans and dogs, why is friendliness in dogs and friendliness in humans, how can that possibly be related? It turns out that there's been studies that have looked at, this was a group out of USC and out of Europe, that looked at, compared modern humans to Neanderthals. And somewhat of the premise they came up with is modern humans, that means all of you, I hope, are domesticated. And so it kind of makes sense that there's these genes that code for domestication that are very common across both all domesticated animals. You can see here, this particular slide shows an overlap between the genes that seem to have been selected for between Cro-Magnon, or modern humans and Neanderthal, and all different types of domesticated animals, horses, cats, dogs, various animals. So there is this crossover. So we can very well think of ourselves as domesticated animals. And it actually makes a lot of sense because while humans can certainly be very violent and so forth, we actually do work together very well. And we generally are much less aggressive than a lot of other species. So in some sense, we are domesticated. Another interesting point is you look at the cranial morphology between modern humans and Neanderthals, and you see very similar changes in their cranial morphology between wolves and dogs. You see, actually Neanderthals actually had a larger brain than modern humans do, much like wolves have a larger brain than dogs do. You'll see a change in the length of their jaw. The Neanderthals had a much longer jaw compared to modern humans. The same is true between humans and
dogs and wolves.
So it actually isn't quite as surprising when you hear about the fact that there's all these genes that seem to have been selected for in domestication that also are present in humans. So, and this brings up a really interesting book by an anthropologist out of Penn State. And her theory is that people wouldn't be people had it not been for this relationship that we formed with dogs thousands of years ago. Her theory is that this is actually what enabled us to become the dominant hominid on the planet. So at that point, there were Neanderthals on the planet, there was Homo sapiens on the planet, and somehow we won. They lost. And her premise is that we domesticated dogs, and that combination of dogs and humans was unstoppable, and it allowed us to create all the things that we see today. It allowed us to, it was a template for future domestication. The dog was really, in most people's view, the first animal that was ever domesticated was a dog. First thing that was ever domesticated was a dog. We domesticated other animals after that, we domesticated plants after that. One of the plants we domesticated was wheat. A natural form of wheat doesn't really work well, but we domesticated wheat, and what do we get from that? We get beer, which is why we're all here today. So this is it's an interesting hypothesis that none of us would be here had it not been for this meeting between dogs, proto-dogs, early dogs, and early humans. So all of this comes up back to the beginning because some researchers decided to listen to what these foxes had to say.
Aww.
Thank you.